If you are a follower of Yahshua the Messiah, or if you call yourself a Christian, should you be keeping the holy days that are mentioned in Leviticus 23, or should you be keeping the holidays that are popular among most Christians in the world today, which are namely Christmas and Easter? That's what we're going to talk about today. I'm not going to talk about Christmas and Easter. You can do research on those. I have a few videos on Christmas and some of its symbols and traditions, and you can easily find a lot of information about where Christmas comes from. But let's talk about the holy days that are mentioned in the Bible. And should you, as a believer or a Christian, should you be keeping the holy days mentioned in Leviticus 23? Many people say that they are the Jews' holy days, but the Bible actually says that they are Yahweh's holy days. So if they are His holy days, then they should be important to us because we are believers of Yeshua and Yahweh. What I want to talk about and prove to you is that these holy days are first mentioned as far back as Genesis in the Garden of Eden, right after creation, or along with creation, and then at the time of Abraham, which is 400 years before Moses received the commandments. And then again, they are kept a few thousand years later at the time of Yeshua, the Messiah, and the apostles. And after Yeshua's death and resurrection, they are mentioned again and again, up to 50, 60, 70 years after his death, they are still mentioned. And then again, we will see that they're going to be kept in the millennium when Yeshua returns to earth and establishes his kingdom. The holy days are going to be kept again. So my thesis is that if the holy days were kept before they were even pronounced, and Moses had them written down or wrote them down in the book of Leviticus, they were mentioned even before that and kept before that, then they were kept at that time when he received it. They were kept at the time of ancient Israel wandering in the desert. And then they were kept again at the time, I shouldn't say again, they were continued to be kept at the time of Yeshua and the apostles. And they're going to be kept in the millennium. The question is, why would we not be keeping the holy days now, 2,000 years later, and just a few years before his return? Why wouldn't we be keeping them now? Why would we be keeping Christmas and Easter, which have nothing to do with Yahweh and his plan and with Yeshua and his plan? They are pagan holy days that come from fertility rites and sun worship, if you study them well enough. Let's take a look. It says in Genesis 2 and verse 3, "Then Yahweh blessed the seventh day and sanctified it, because in it he rested from all his work, which Yahweh had created and made." So we see the seventh day, the Sabbath. You might be saying, why am I mentioning that? Well, actually, when you take a look at chapter 23 of Leviticus, you're going to see that the first holy day that is mentioned is the weekly holy day, and that's the Sabbath. The Sabbath is a weekly feast, a weekly holy day. And then we have the annual holy days that are mentioned there too. In Genesis 14 verse 18, it says, "Then Melchizedek," which we know from the book of Hebrews, Melchizedek refers to Yeshua himself. He was on the earth as this priest of Salem, the king of Salem. His name was Melchizedek, and he was there. And it says that he brought, when he visited Abraham, Abraham had Sarah make bread very quickly, so we know that it was unleavened bread. And before that, he washed his feet, which was a tradition at the time. But these are two of the major symbols of the Passover, when we wash each other's feet and then we have bread and wine. So this could have been during the Passover period. It's a little bit speculative, but it could well have been. Then in Genesis 18, we see that, well, that's where that's mentioned, in Genesis 18. Then we also see in Leviticus 23 that is where you will read about the Sabbath and all of the holy days. The holy days are in order, starting from the beginning of the holy day year to the end: Passover, Then the days of unleavened bread for 7 days. During those days of unleavened bread, you have the wave sheaf offering. Then in early June, late May, you have Pentecost, which is also called Shavuot sometimes. Then in September, usually there's a feast called the Feast of Trumpets. Then the Day of Atonement. Then the Feast of Tabernacles for 7 days. It's called Sukkot. And then you have the last great day. So now let's take a look at these days in the New Testament. So you might be wondering, they actually appear in the New Testament? Yes. You just have to read through the New Testament and pay attention and don't skim over them when they're mentioned. And they are mentioned for our good. They're there for us, and they are kept by the apostles well after Yeshua's death. So if these were done away with, as many say, why would they continue to keep these 50 years after Yeshua's death in some cases? Because they were never done away with. So it says in Acts 27:9, now when much time had been spent and sailing was now dangerous because the fast was already over, Paul advised them. So you can read that. The fast is referring to the Day of Atonement. That is when you fast for 24 hours. In 1 Corinthians 5, verses 6 through 8, it says, your glorifying is not good. Do you not know that a little leaven leavens the whole lump? Therefore, purge out the old leaven, that you may be a new lump, since you truly are unleavened. For indeed, Messiah, our Passover, was sacrificed for us. Therefore, let us keep the feast, not with old leaven, nor with the leaven of malice and wickedness, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. So he's actually saying, keep the feast. This was many years after Yeshua's death, and they are still keeping the Feast of Tabernacles, and he's the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and Paul is telling them, keep the feast. 1 Corinthians chapter 16, verse 8, but I will tarry in Ephesus until Pentecost. There we have Pentecost mentioned. Pentecost is also called Shavuot in the Old Testament. These people draw near me, Yeshua is speaking here, near me with their mouth, and honor me with their lips, but their heart is far from me, and in vain they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men. That's Matthew 15, verses 8 and 9. And that's what Yeshua even prophesied, that people would be teaching doctrines of men, commandments of men, as if they were real biblical doctrines, like keeping Christmas or Easter or other things that aren't even mentioned in the Bible and were never kept by anyone in the Bible. It says in Luke 2, verses 41 and 42, his parents went to Jerusalem every year at the feast of Passover, and when he was 12 years old, they went up to Jerusalem according to the custom of the feast. Then it says in Leviticus 23, verse 2, John, verse 2 and verse 13. Now the Passover of the Jews was at hand, and Yeshua went up to Jerusalem. Now he says it here that the Passover of the Jews, because at that time, 2,000 years ago, there were only Jews left in Israel. All of the other Israeli tribes had left. But these are the feasts of Yahweh, not the feasts of the Jews. And it even says in Leviticus 23:2, you can read that for yourself, Yahweh says that these are my feasts. So he even calls them his feasts. In John chapter 7, verses 1 and 2, it says, after these things, Yeshua walked in Galilee, for he did not want to walk in Judea, because the Jews sought to kill him. Now the Jews' Feast of Tabernacles was at hand. Again, he's calling it the Jews' Feast of Tabernacles because Jews were the ones that were living in Israel at that time. But these were the feasts of Yahweh. Then it says in John chapter 7 and verse 37, on the last day, that great day of the feast, Yeshua stood and cried out, saying, if anyone thirsts, let him come to me and drink. He who believes in me, as the scripture has said, out of his heart will flow rivers of living water. And this is in reference to the last great day. It's the 8th day. It's right after the day immediately after the Feast of Tabernacles.